Good evening and welcome to this Sunday evening's interview. We are delighted that you've joined us to spend the next 45 minutes or so with Jordan Scott. Just before we kick off, I'm just going to run through a few notices. I am glancing down at my notes for the notices. So just a little reminder, if you can keep your mics on during the sort of first phase, keep your mics muted, please, during the first phase of the interview, but then there will be the opportunity to ask questions later. And then if you'd like to ask your questions verbally, then it'd be fine to unmute your mic at that point. We suggest that if you don't already have it on speaker view, if you go to the top right of your screen, you should have an option there to click the little icon and to select speaker view. And that means that then during the interview, you'll see Jordan highlighted or spotlighted, and you won't then be searching for him on the screen. If you would like to put questions as they occur to you in the chat as we go, then that'd be fine. And when we come to the questions, we can also pick up questions from the chat function. If you would benefit from having captions, we do have Zoom's auto transcription enabled. Zoom's auto transcription is most definitely not an exact science, but some people find them helpful to support the audio content. If you would like to switch on those transcriptions and switch on the captions so that you can see them, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll either see a little icon that says transcription or CC for subtitles, or where you see the three dots, you can click that and select to switch those captions on. I have nearly reached the end of the housekeeping notices. You'll be pleased to know, I'm sure. Just to make it clear, we are recording this session because we'd like to make it available for other people to view it afterwards. If you would prefer not to be shown on that recording, it is absolutely fine to switch off your video if you prefer to. And also, if you'd like to change your name so that your name doesn't appear on the screen at any point, you can also, if you right click on the image of yourself, you can select rename, and you can just put a letter in or anything you want, or a different name, so that you can remain anonymous. And with that, I think that is all of the notices. George, yell if I have forgotten anything. And I'm going to take a no yell as that's fine.
This is no yell. You're spot on. I can't think of anything else. That's ideal.
Thank you for the no yell there. So welcome to this evening's interview. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Jordan Scott, who's spending this evening with us. Jordan is a Canadian writer with many strings to his writing bow, including poetry, prose poetry, writing and visual collaborations with photographers, and a sound, visual and written word account of the 5 days he spent visiting the detention centre at Guantanamo Bay. In 2020, he turned his hand to children's literature, writing I Talk Like a River, which was recognised as Best Children's Book of the Year for 2020 by Publishers Weekly. And that was already making quite a stir in the UK, and it came to even greater prominence last October when it was, I can't quite think of the word I want, but when it was featured on the CBeebies Bedtime Stories read by Ed Sheeran. So Jordan, welcome. It is absolutely fantastic to have you with us this evening.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. It's so wonderful to be here. It's so wonderful to be here with everyone. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, so I thought we would, if it's all right with you, we would kick off talking about I Talk Like a River. for anybody who hasn't seen it, this is what the cover of the book looks like. I was just wondering, how closely does the tale "And I Talk Like a River" reflect your own experience? Is this a story from your head, or is this you?
Well, it's most definitely a story from my childhood between my father and I. So it's really something that, it's really something that happened, that I always remembered and was really kind of stuck in my memories somewhere. It's a real kind of a visceral and like abstract memory, but one that and I mean, I think it because it gave me a lot of comfort when I was a child, and even still today. But I do think that it's very close to what my dad really gifted me, saying that my stutter is like the river. The way that I speak is the way that water moves, which really also kind of launched, or I guess, my own like poetic imagination as well. So I mean, hilariously, my dad doesn't remember any of it, which I always think is kind of interesting. He's I mean, my mother is the creative a poet, photographer. My dad's more of like a, smokes a pipe, drinks beer, likes to fish, doesn't really read. So it was pretty shocking. I think he's really shocked too that he came up with something like that. But it's definitely a joke in our family that he doesn't remember it.
Oh, I love that. And it's really interesting, isn't it, that how a moment which is so significant for one person, and that one person in that exchange might carry that, is just different for somebody else, that their perception and their memory of that event. I love that, these really individual ways that we respond to conversations.
Yes, absolutely. And I think too, when it comes to stuttering, I know that as a father, as a parent, I tend to always, not all the time, but always try to rehearse the lessons I want to give my children. And I really like that the one that my dad told me was really spontaneous. I think there's a real kind of beauty in that, where it wasn't rehearsed at all. It was just something that kind of came to him, but also came to him outside of his comfort zone in terms of how he thinks of the world. So I think it's just really interesting to think how the stutter has also impacted him, because he doesn't stutter, but in that moment he had like this really profound understanding of what it means to stutter.
So, taking all that into account, that this idea of, there's a child at the heart of that story, but then also, as you said, there's how the stammering is impacting on your father, and then his response to it in a moment. Who are you writing "I Talk Like a River" for?
I think that's a really good question. I think in the very beginning, it was I wanted to write a story specifically to honor my dad. And then it became, because I started thinking of this story when my children were very young, and I noticed them. I'm the only one who stutters in my family, and I noticed them even as small children. They would kind of I noticed them started to like fixate on the way that I speak. So I also wanted to write the story for them to kind of explain the way that their father talks. And those were the two motivations, I think, at the beginning. What's interesting is up until last year, I think that, well, I don't think I know, up until last year, I had never spoken to another stutterer before. I've been very isolated in that regard from any kind of community. So I think, as a long way to answer that question, when I started to meet with other people that stutter, and especially children, that's like I felt like that's a real gift for me to see how the book is impacting people who stutter as well. So I think that I just always find it like interesting that I wasn't thinking about that when I was writing the book, but it does make sense because because I've always been quite alone with my stutter, as I said.
So did it feel, so it sounds as if you sort of, the book has sort of thrust you into this community that you weren't particularly interacting with before. Did you see that coming?
No, not at all. It was it's genuinely like a surprise. I just all the work I've been doing with stuttering associations in Canada and the United States. I wasn't expecting that for some reason. It's been
at all sort of vulnerable. I don't know, somehow this one aspect of you, like one amongst very, very many aspects, has that been a comfortable experience, or has that been at all uncomfortable, sort of being like thrust into it in that way?
I mean, before the kids book, I've written poetry books on stuttering, and I've stood in front of audiences and like all over the world really, and just read from the poetry that I wrote specifically designed to be very difficult for me to say. So I mean, I've always been very open about stuttering. I think what's different with the kids book is, as you said, it is more vulnerable because the poetry is kind of removed, because I see it as like a real artistic exercise in a way, if that makes sense. Where the kids book, I felt and feel vulnerable, but I also think that's okay. Like I mean, for me, that's often where my work comes from a place of vulnerability.
there's something very sort of beautiful in that vulnerability, and I really found that it's rare that I've seen a children's book where the writing and the illustrations seem to be so inextricably intertwined. Like they don't just seem to run parallel to one another. They very much seem to be interacting with one another, if that makes sense, sort of becoming more than the sum of their parts. But I believe that it's common for illustrators and writers to work quite separately. And I just wondered what that process was for I Talk Like a River.
Well, Sydney and I didn't speak at all. I think we only had one meeting together. And then the rest of it was him doing those illustrations by himself, and I think that I think it really speaks to him as an artist and as a you know, and as a person too, because there's a lot of ways that stuttering can and is depicted in art and literature, which is oftentimes, I think for me at least, not particularly true to the experience of stuttering itself, the psychological and the physical experience of stuttering. And I think that someone such as Sydney, who doesn't stutter, to create a book that, like, I just find that the way he responded to it, like the whole landscape of the book, it becomes a world that stutters itself, because his materials are the way that he, you know, sort of paints, the way that he depicts the scene. Everything becomes a stutter, so much so that it becomes naturalized. Like that's just the world, that's the universe that we're in. And you know, and that's just amazing. I mean, I love that he did that. I just think it's very beautiful.
And when you first saw those illustrations, is it something where sort of over time they sort of grow on you and you begin to think, oh yeah, this really works? Or did you see them right away and think, Sydney's got it, like he gets it?
Yeah, I thought straight away that he got it. I think what was most shocking to me is that there's not really anywhere in the book at all where, like, the part of the book where the character, the child, is submerging themselves in the water. That's not part of the book, but that definitely, I think, for me, is such an experience of, it's such a beautiful experience of the sort of process of stuttering for me and the experience of it. I remember the poet Philip Larkin wrote this poem, and within it he says, he's talking about speech, and he says, blort, jam, rejoice. And I think that what Sydney did, that kind of experience of having the character swim in the water and just be totally enveloped in the sound and the sense of the river, which is also his stutter, is really, really quite marvelous, right?
Yeah, and that really, I feel like, because I was going to move on and ask you a little bit about blurt, which is the collection of is a poetry you were referring to earlier, which is this sort of physical sort of exploration of that the physical and sort of cognitive experience of stuttering. And when you're saying just then about the boy sort of in the water and it being all around him, him being a part of that, I found that very reminiscent of reading the poetry collection Blurt, when it's somehow all around you, inside you, you can sort of feel and taste the moments of stuttering, and almost like the fantastic journeys they lead you down and all the dead ends and the random associations that might then start to occur. It just felt like a real like a bringing to others of what that experience is like. And later this year, we've got the Stammerfest Global Conference, which is a conference which is a sort of a collaboration between Stammer, our organisation, and the International Stuttering Association. And one of the plenary sessions at that event is going to be exploring the notion of beauty in stuttering. And you've kind of touched on that a little bit already, but I wondered if you could expand on what your view of that is. You know, like, is there beauty there, or is that a ridiculous suggestion? What do you think?
I mean, I think I'll start by saying, like, so sometimes this is how I often explain it, just so sometimes I just want to order a coffee without having to rehearse and without having to plan and sweat and have all those social anxieties. But I think the majority of my time has been spent sort of exploring, as you said, like how the stutter can be beautiful. Because for me, if I think about it on the level of, so stutters have, I think, and again, I'm just speaking to my own stutter, but I think for my own stutter, stutters have a very intimate relationship with language, in terms of that we can feel it like everywhere in our bodies. So we can kind of feel the way that consonants or plosives or vowels are designed to make our bodies move. And I think that's pretty incredible, just on that kind of level. So I think there's some beauty in the physicality of it, in our relationship to words and how they sound and how our bodies move, because there's always kind of like beauty in that kind of intimate relationship. And then I also think that there's a beauty in the stutter, because it enacts a kind of listening that maybe other people do not have, in the purest sense of the way, right? To listen, to pay attention to not interrupt. And I think that listening, that kind of gesture, that space that you give to people to speak, that's also beautiful. And then I think as like a kind of poetry nerd, I think stuttering sounds really beautiful. Like there's a lot of parts to stuttering that are very musical. Sometimes when I hear myself stutter, you know, I can hear that. I can hear parts of certain, you know, certain styles of dance music or hip hop, where language and sound is manipulated to create like those beats or those prolonged, you know, ligations as well. And then I also think that is beautiful because we know a lot of words. I think that's one of the most beautiful things, is that the stutters that I know are kind of thesaurus, or like this kind of like lexical stacking is just such a wonderful way to be kind of fully immersed in the language that we're speaking. So that would be my answer to that. It's a really great question.
It's really exciting to hear you speak about beauty on all these different levels and like all these different perspectives. Are you able to bring that sort of awareness to individual moments of stuttering? Like, are these things that you see from a distance when you look at your own experience of stuttering? Or are you able to be aware and to appreciate that in the moment, that sort of moment of stuckness and difference?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say sometimes, right? I would say not all the time, but sometimes, right? It's very complicated for me on that level, right? That's why I kind of started on the level of just wanting to order a coffee, right? So I think it's complicated, and I think it will always remain so, right? But I think when you're dealing with something as complex as stuttering, it's always going to be, you know, it's always going to be that mixture of, you know, you know, pleasure, just the comfort, you know, beauty, anxiety, all those things, right? So yeah, sometimes I am, and that's okay. Like, I think for me, that's the older I get, that's probably the best I'm going to do, and that's okay, right? Because it's certainly, you know, better than when I was a kid, when I didn't see any of that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that ability to hold all these contradictions at the same time, yes, and to appreciate all of them. That it doesn't need to be all or nothing to make sense.
Yes.
We will move to questions from the audience, but I had one last question before I give up my opportunity to ask all these questions that I want to ask. Now, your work seems to be really quite varied in form, but often linking back into ideas about speech and speech patterns and repetitions and loops and blocks, but sort of like in different ways and in these different, within poetry and children's literature and sound projects and all these different things. What's next for you? And is stuttering and these ideas around these patterns and this richness that these moments of stuckness can bring, are we likely to see that continuing to feature within your work?
You know, I think so. I mean, I'm I've written two more children's books that are coming out, but they aren't about stuttering. And then I'm working on a nonfiction book, which is essentially trying to pull together all my work around stuttering over the last, maybe 20 years into one place. So I think in that book, I'm hoping to bring it all together in a way that I maybe haven't before, kind of take all those threads as you talked about and try to weave them together.
Sounds very exciting. You're clearly not resting on your laurels, Jordan. You're like, and I've written 2 more children's books and got this big project in process. Sounds really exciting. Yeah,
I'm hopeful. I've always been interested. Remember that movie, A Fish Called Wanda?
Yes, very much so.
I remember watching that movie that the first time, for the very first time, and it was the very first time that I saw myself outside of my body, and it was really traumatic. I mean, because that character is not presented very well, and I had this moment where I saw myself, and I saw what I believed other people saw, right? And I want to write about that, but I also want to write about this kind of connection that I've been thinking about over the years, because in that movie, that character stuttering Ken is being interrogated, being asked where are the diamonds, and even when I was watching it as a kid, I was thinking, well, it's not possible for him to it's not possible for him to say where the diamonds are. And every time he tried to say it, the character who was asking questions thought he was lying. And the more that I kind of read and just paid attention to the wider culture, there is this idea of disfluent or stuttered speech as not telling the truth, as lying. And I'm really interested in that because I don't think that it's talked about enough. And I think it presents a lot of the problems that kind of need to be brought out. So that's definitely going to be part of the book.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and a part of my role at Stammer is that I coordinate our helpline and web chat services, and certainly we've had contact from people who have been witnesses to a crime but haven't necessarily been believed in their witness statements because the police conducting the interview have mistaken stuttering for dishonesty.
Yes.
So we've certainly seen that happening very much in real life with very much real world consequences.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, it's fascinating and really, really important, isn't it? Like how that plays out in the real world.
Yes, because sorry.
No, you go, Jordan.
Well, because the irony of it is that fluency is actually the lie. That there's an idea that everybody is fluent, because we're not. Even people without stutters don't speak in that way. Everybody has hesitations, like, but. There's all kinds of other variations in the way we speak. And it's interesting when I went to Guantanamo Bay and actually talked to FBI interrogators who train other interrogators, they actually say that that's one of the most difficult things to train out of someone, is the belief that disfluent speech is not truthful, right? Which is fascinating to me, that it's actually what they're supposed to look for is people who have like well-rehearsed narratives with no breaks in their speech. That's like, in terms of linguistically, that's a sign of not telling the truth, right? But it can't. But there's all these. I think there's such a cultural belief in the opposite that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get beyond that.
That is really, really interesting. I'm going to hand over to the audience who may want to ask questions. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat or to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We've already got a question or two in the chat. So, so I'm going to start there. I'm just scrolling through the chat now. So we have George, who's actually come in and commented that I love the way you explain this natural stammering world that's been created by Sydney, the illustrator of I Talk Like a River. And George is asking if you have any favourite writers or artists or creators who also stammer.
Oh, that's interesting. I think I think historically maybe Lewis Carroll, Philip Larkin. I think that those are the two that come to mind. Contemporarily, there's a really wonderful artist named Jerome Ellis, who I think is doing some really beautiful work around stuttering. Yeah,
and Jerome Ellis is going to be one of the speakers at the plenary around beauty in stammering at Stammerfest. Thinking about the work he's been doing. Okay, I'm going to go to Lisa, who both has her hand up, and there's a comment in the chat. Sunny, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi. Here I am, Stammer, and I'm school council. I did a presentation at school.
Well done, Sunny. That sounds amazing.
Wonderful.
I love that you've come to share your good news.
Yeah, so Sunny had to do quite a tricky presentation, but he was a little bit nervous at first because he thought maybe no one would understand his bumpy speech, but he did it and won school councillor.
Oh, way to go, Sunny. That's fantastic.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good on you.
Thank you.
We love it, Sunny. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charlie, do we have a question from Charlie? I can see that your hand is up.
Hi. I have a question. When you read, do you stammer? And if you do, then do you also stammer when you read in your head?
That's a really good question, Charlie. Nice to meet you too. I saw you at the beginning with a copy of the book. I appreciate that. So nice to meet you. Yeah, I think for my own stutter, I stutter more when I read. because for me, when I'm reading, I can't go around the words like I would in conversation. I kind of have to hit all of them and try to get through them. And you asked if I stutter in my head?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never had anyone ask that question before. That's a wonderful question. I don't think that I do, Charlie. I have to, you're really kind of, I have to think about that. That's going to change a lot of things for me. That's a really smart question. My answer right now is going to be probably not, but I don't, yeah. Wow, okay. That's really wonderful. Thanks, Charlie.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. If there are any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand. Oh, Jane has a fantastic question for Charlie.
Yeah.
Charlie, do you stutter in your head? One of the audience members is interested because she thinks she stutters in her head and is wondering, if you stutter in your head.
Well, I mean, I would say probably. I mean, like, sometimes I might actually go without even realizing.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Jane thinks she might too. We've got another question here. This is George again, who's actually commenting how interesting it is that you've mentioned a fish called Wanda, because at Stammer, George is involved in preparing a project around depictions of stammering in film. And so George is just asking Jordan, have you got a favourite or a least favourite depiction of stammering in film? I'm guessing maybe the one you mentioned. Have you got a favourite?
Oh, you know the one I just recently watched, that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? The character who Leonardo DiCaprio plays in that movie. The real life character who he's playing has a stutter, and so Leonardo DiCaprio had a stutter in the film, and I've never seen anything like it before, because none of the characters in the film said anything about his stutter at all. It wasn't addressed, and his character was not like weak either. Was not kind of depicted as being that there was something wrong with him, right? So that's probably my favorite so far. I think it was shocking. I was very shocked by that, in a good way.
It's quite a subtle depiction too, isn't it? Because I think I remember that the character isn't completely comfortable with his stuttering all the time. So we see him like doing rehearsing and getting a bit anxious. So there's a real complexity baked into it.
Yeah, he has to rehearse his script so he doesn't stutter when he's on when he's acting. But then the rest of the times when he's just talking to people, he has he does stutter more. And I think there is a complexity there, and from what I remember, nobody says anything about it, which is also really interesting.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have answered all of the questions. So I just want to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to you, Jordan. It's been absolutely fascinating. thank you very much for letting us chat with you and for lending us your insights and your wisdom. It's been really, really good. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you everyone for coming and spending your Sunday evening with us. It's been lovely to see you all, and we hope to see you all again soon.